modern Linux distros have become really, really big. Of the distros that people, on average, typically use, of course, there's probably some weird thing out there with the whole entire goal of being as big as possible. Of the normal distros, I would say Ubuntu has one of, if not the largest ISO available. This is 5.9 gigabytes for the regular x86-64 version. Obviously, the ARM version is going to be different, but that is a whole different question. For the regular version you're installing on your regular Intel or AMD system, 5.9 gigabyte ISO. Now, it's not that big of a deal, right? Like, you have a thumb drive. There's probably at least 8 gigabytes. Can you even buy a new 4 gigabyte thumb drive? I actually don't know. But if you wanted to use something else, this would be about 4,000 floppy disks, or more reasonably, about 9 CDs. Even in the realm of normal distros, though, there are distros with considerably smaller ISOs. So I thought, hey, it could be fun to go and talk about some of the smallest Linux distros out there. Now, there is an important question on what we are actually talking about and how we define a small distro, because install size and the size of the installer are not necessarily the same number, and in some cases the installed system may be considerably smaller. For the sake of what we're talking about at this very moment, we are focusing on the ISO size, on the installer size, because this is a very easy number to look at, and also, there's a lot of weird distros that end up coming up when we start focusing on this number. Is it ultimately that important of a number for a modern system? No, because again, you have a thumb drive that fits the installer. If it fits the installer, it's totally fine. But I still think there's something interesting to talk about here. Also, we will be sticking with the x86-64 versions of these distros, because if we start talking about 32-bit versions, naturally you're going to start running into some like weird older distros that nobody actually uses now. Also, we might start talking about like ports to random consoles that nobody actually uses. Like, people use like a PS3 version of Linux and things like that, but ports for like ancient consoles that barely count as actually being Linux. We're not talking about those. Something that theoretically could run on an x86-64 system. Now, is it going to? Well, that's another question entirely. Let's start from my go-to distro of choice, Arch Linux. Now, the installed version actually is really quite small, and most people know Arch as this really lightweight, really simple, really minimal distro, but the ISO actually is a bit larger than you might expect. Currently, for the latest version in July of 2026, 1.5 gigabytes. Now, that's still quite small, but there was a time for a very long time that this would fit on a single CD. When it no longer did, that was a really big deal, and from then on, it kind of started to not balloon, but quickly increase in size. It's been around this size for quite a while now, so I don't really expect it to change anytime soon. It might, but I don't think we're ever getting to the size of something like Ubuntu, right? Because we're not including a desktop. There's a lot of things that are not being included. If that happens, there's a problem. Going to another very popular option, we have Gentoo. This is sitting at 1.1 gigabytes, which actually is smaller than Arch, but it's probably larger than you might expect. Gentoo still isn't going to fit on a singular CD. It does say could be burned on a CD, and there was a time where this could be done, and not anymore. You're not doing that anymore. There are no, I don't think there are CDs that got, I think the max on a CD is like 900 megabytes, but regular CDs, about 700 or so. Let's go even further. Let's go to Void Linux. The current version of this for both the glibc and the muscle version, this is for the base version, not the XFCE version, is around about 1 gigabyte. Now we are certainly getting somewhere, but still much larger than what is actually possible. Now we can start talking about the actual small distros, and by small, I don't mean lightweight. Anything of the past 20 or so years, you have plenty of space for a distro. You don't need something that is microscopic to be able to install it. So yes, there are projects like Anti-X which are known for running well on old hardware. Yes, something like a Linux Mint is also going to run great on that hardware as well, albeit Mint actually is a relatively large download. Anytime you have a semi-modern GUI, that is what is going to happen, also with a lot of drivers installed and all that good stuff. This is not what we're talking about here. Instead, there is another project, that being Puppy Linux. Puppy Linux is also very well known for running great on this old hardware, and also currently still has a fairly small ISO. Now, there are a bunch of different versions of Puppy Linux, so actually saying, this is the size of it can't really be done. So let's go over a couple of them. When we are talking about the Wayland version, this is using LabWC. This sits around 1.1 gigabytes. When we are talking about the retro version, this makes use of X11 and JWM. This is around 937 megabytes, but this is still with the Debian-based version. If we move off of the Debian base and go to the Void base, this gets us down to 549 megabytes, and then Slackware, 497. This is well within the range of a single CD for installation. But this is also not the end. We can go much, much further. Thus far, I had not mentioned it, and there's a good reason for that. The ISO for Alpine Linux is even smaller. For the x86-64 version, this is currently at 352 megabytes. We could fit almost 2 of these on a single CD, which honestly is kind of crazy. Now, why would you do that? You wouldn't. But you can. Alpine doesn't make use of the GNU utils or glibc. It instead uses BusyBox and Muscle libc. These are much lighter variants both in performance and installation size, and this is a big part of the reason why it can get down to this size, let alone the fact that Alpine isn't really intended for, regular hardware. Most people that are running it are talking about servers, are talking about embedded use cases, are talking about containers, and the installation size for this can get much, much smaller than that ISO. Now let's go to something you very well may not have heard of. SLITAS, SLITAS, how are you supposed to say it? This cuts a lot of space. Now we get down to 55 megabytes. At least for this version, there is another version which gets us down to about 28 megabytes. This is for a TTY only. This one, I believe, is going to have a desktop. You might not even think that is possible, right? You might be like, oh, how does the kernel even fit there? The kernel has millions of lines of code. If you're willing to cut out a lot of functionality from the kernel, that's not impossible. You can very well get a kernel that is under a megabyte if you cut basically everything out. Obviously, it's going to have some pretty big limitations. For example, you are making use of BusyBox, and BusyBox, whilst being a good solution, isn't the GNU core utils. There is a lot of software out there that is built around both options and bugs in those tools. But if you want to make something as small as possible, these are the kinds of sacrifices you need to start making. You're going to have something which probably isn't going to work on most hardware, right? You're not going to have NVIDIA support here. Of course, you're not going to have NVIDIA support here. And there's a lot of things which have to be cut, some of which you might be using, okay? But there's going to be file system support that isn't working here. Why do you need all of these extra file systems? Frankly, all you need is one. That's all you really need. Around this point, traditionally, I would have mentioned DSL or damn small Linux. The reason I didn't mention it is because the new version is no longer damn small. It's still pretty small. It'll still fit onto a CD. The goal of the project now is sub 700 megabytes. In the past, though, it was a 50 megabyte distribution. That was cool. But also, software is getting bigger, you want more functionality, and having that 50 megabyte limit is extremely limiting in what you can actually do. Giving yourself a bit more freedom to go to a CD size, whilst it's still relatively small, is way easier to work with. At 700 megabytes, you're not cutting out file systems and basic drivers and basic core functionality that users expect to be there. You can build something which is a totally functional distro. No, it's not going to have GNOME and 500 applications installed, but it's totally fine to use. Let us go even further to a project created by a former maintainer of damn small Linux, Tiny Core Linux, which also has very tiny font for some reason. This has a couple of different versions. There is Core Plus. This is going to include a bunch of additional stuff that is nice and makes it convenient to use, but is still quite light. Then you have Tiny Core. This still comes with a GUI, making use of a desktop with FLTK and FLWM. Then you have the Core version. This takes us down to 17 megabytes. The intro for the project basically says, if you don't know what Tiny Core is, if you can't understand what it is, this is probably not the distro for you. This is not a distro for most people. This is a distro with a very specific purpose. It's not going to be simple. It's not going to be easy. It's not just going to work. You're going to have to work some stuff out yourself. This is probably the stopping point for a usable distro. Going any further than this point is when we start have to making cuts to actually being able to run on real actual hardware, but we can go smaller. There is a dead project from 2019 called Minimal, or Minimal Linux Live. The last release of this was at 10 megabytes. That's not the stopping point though. If you're willing to go down basically to a educational distro. This is what a Linux distro is. This is not something that is actually useful for daily driving. We can go to TinyBox Linux. This has an ISO of 3.7 megabytes. There's basically nothing here. There is basically nothing here, like, at all. You need to run this in a virtual machine. This will not run on real hardware. This makes use of something known as a Linux kernel tiny config. This is one of the options available in their make build. Tiny config basically is the smoke test for the kernel. This is our makefile works, we can build the kernel, our build pipeline works, but this is not something that is useful to run whatsoever. This is something that just exists to make sure it can be compiled. Now, there is a follow-up project, but this gets a little bit larger. I did say earlier we were going to talk about things that run on x86-64, and technically this doesn't because it needs to be in a virtual machine. You're not actually running this. It's technically x86-64, but it won't run on any actual real hardware, so it is technically, but like only technically. However, we can go smaller because this still has a working Unix environment. It makes use of something known as Toybox. These are really lightweight Unix tools. These are actually used by Android. This is not just some like random throwaway project. Now we get into the issue of what is the definition of a Linux distro, because we've already gone well past GNU/Linux, right? When we went past Alpine, we were well past GNU/Linux. What is a Linux distro? What needs to be there for it to be a distro? Because technically, a distro is a distribution of Linux, of the kernel. So, if you are willing to do a make tiny config which disables everything, it wasn't going to be like a make tiny config with some basic things enabled, but like true smoke test kernel. This can get you down to a couple 100 kilobytes. If you distribute that, it's technically a distribution. Technically a distribution. If you're willing to sacrifice just a tiny bit more, you can then get a distro that is able to output to the console. And if you then went and said, oh, I'm going to just output, I don't know, Hello World, technically a distro. Not useful, not usable, but technically. But besides that just not really being usable, it's also at that point something entirely custom. So whether you want to consider that to be a distro if you're not distributing it to anyone, I don't know. The real, actual, smallest distro that is actually able to do something useful, we obviously have to move away from x86-64, but there are projects out there like Flop Linux. There are projects for booting off a floppy disk, a single floppy disk, usually entirely for the function of doing a net boot. This technically is a distro. There's a kernel, there's some basic tools, but you're not really installing from this, you're installing over the network making use of this. Does that count? I would say it counts a little bit more, but that's just me. But it is going to be very, very hardware dependent on what you can actually use here. It's going to be for really old hardware. It's going to be for very specific kinds of use cases. It's not really a general purpose distro. Now, if we shift gears and instead talk about installed size, things can get wildly different from the size of the ISO. For example, with Arch Linux, the ISO is around 1.5 gigabytes, with a clean install of Arch around 200 megabytes installed. So you can't really directly compare the two in that same kind of way. The ISO is going to include a lot of extra things to make the initial installation easier, like drivers for various different hardware that you may not have in your final installation. But when we're talking about something that is a real project that you can actually really use, if we're talking about an Alpine Linux container, these can easily get down to 5 or so megabytes. Can you go smaller? Yes. Are there stupid things you can do to get like under a megabyte? Absolutely. Do we consider those to be distros? That's up to you, because even with old distros, right, you weren't installing them generally on a single floppy. You'd usually have multiple and have to swap them in throughout the process. This has not been every single tiny distro out there. I'm sure there are plenty of others you can point me to. I'm sure there are some weird projects out there that existed at some point in time. But I just want to talk about the art of the tiny Linux distro. A thing which most people are never going to use, which in many cases isn't actually useful on real hardware, but is still something which somebody says, you know what, I want to do. I want to go make it, and I want to see what is actually possible out there with Linux, because again, you can make a kernel that is very small. You can combine that with just basically nothing, and it's pretty much a distro. Kinda. In some cases, if it actually runs on your hardware. Anyway, if you got some fun examples to talk about, let me know in the description down below. If there's anything else you want to highlight, I'd love to hear. If there's something you'd want to see a video on, let me know as well. And if you really liked the video, and actually go subscribe as well, if you really liked the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, Scribes, Daily Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and damn. That's small.
Like this.